Hi, I'm Kevin Howlick from the ILR School and the Institute for Compensation Studies. With me is Linda Barrington, the Managing Director of the Institute for Compensation Studies. Welcome to our webinar from the ILR School on jobs and pay. Remember that you can write in questions to us that we'll try to address during the webcast. We have a few that we've already been sent in advance that we'll try to address along the way. First of all, we're going to talk about jobs and pay today, and we're starting with a couple of statistics that were released just last week. One is on employment, the other is on compensation levels, as you can see on the screen now, and we'll try to get back to those as we go along in the webcast. I'd like to start with the employment situation, and last Thursday the payroll numbers were released again, and we saw that 157,000 jobs were added in the U.S. economy. At the same time, though, the unemployment rate increased from 7.8% to 7.9%. I think more and more people are understanding that these things can happen simultaneously, but I just want to say a little bit about that. First of all, they come from two surveys. One's of employers, one's from employees. And the second is, at the same time, jobs are being added because of the way the unemployment rate is calculated. It's the ratio of people looking for work divided by the number of people in the labor force. More people might have come back into the labor force thinking that things are getting better. So we saw 157,000 jobs were added to the U.S. economy, and the unemployment rate ticked up just a tiny bit.
So let's look a little under that top line number. And one of the things that was very interesting in this month's numbers is that it's the first time that we saw a perfect convergence of the unemployment rate for men and women since this recession started in 2007. And we saw that this has really been a recession that impacted men more than women. So their highest unemployment rate went up to 10.4%. This is the blue line on your PowerPoint slide there. And it's for men over the age of 20. If you look for women, we never hit more than 8.4% unemployment for women. So this recession, which is past, and we're on the recovery side of it, was certainly something that impacted men more than women. But also age mattered in these unemployment numbers. So these are the numbers for men and women over 20. If we add in those of the youngest labor market participants, those who were ages 16 to 19, you can see how much higher, dramatically higher unemployment rate is for the youngest workers in our country. So typically they were almost triple what we saw for those over the age of 20. It's important to think about this age issue from both the youngest and the oldest perspective. So while the unemployment rate is more likely to be higher for the youngest workers, once an employee is unemployed, the probability that they stay unemployed for a longer time actually gets worse as you get older. So what we see in this chart is the most recent numbers for the percentage of unemployed Americans who were long-term unemployed. This is 27 weeks or longer. And we see that as you age, for those over the age of 30, perhaps, you've got double the likelihood of being unemployed long-term compared to the youngest workers. So we've got two different ways that age really plays as a major factor in the unemployment rates. When you're young, you're more likely to be unemployed, but if you become unemployed, you're more likely to stay unemployed longer if you're an older worker.
That brings us to this next picture, which is actually quite interesting, and there's a lot going on in this, so let's take a minute to stare at it. We're economists. We can't help ourselves. We like to look at numbers. This is a picture which is depicting a bunch of recessions since 1973, each recession since 1973, and it plots the U.S. unemployment rate in the months subsequent to the start of the recession. So let's, for example, look at the black line, which is the most recent recession, which started in December of 2007. And we can see there that at the start of that recession, unemployment was a little bit above 4%. And it rose quite slowly to up over 10%, as Linda said earlier, but it stayed up much higher. The recession that began in July 1981 was also a very deep recession, was very bad for the labor market. You can see in the orange line that the highest level of unemployment during that recession went up over 10%. But what's interesting is unemployment fell in the months and years subsequent to the start of that recession much more rapidly, as it did in all the other recessions in the last 30 years or so. But this recession that started in December of 2007 has just persisted in the labor market. And you can see that black line is still way up there. There are very, very long-term, long rates of unemployment.
Now, Kevin, we did just get a question in that asked about what some of the factors may be that explain why men and women's unemployment rates were different in this recession, men being more impacted than women until these last couple months. Is there something in this recession that also makes that difference, or is that typically the case?
There's typically historically, male unemployment can tick up in a recession more quickly, and one of the traditional reasons for that is because of the historical that recessions are associated with decline in manufacturing. Male workers, often more unionized workers, are much more likely to be in manufacturing industries that are more cyclical. That certainly, as manufacturing has left the U.S. In the last 30 years or so, that's less so. But that's sort of an interesting, I think that's the most obvious one, is that the male jobs are more associated with manufacturing. What this picture, though, means for the labor market is interesting, and we're going to try to get into that in a couple of ways. One is, I think there's certain literature in the last few years that have discussed the decline in the implicit contract, the implicit employment contract between workers and firms. That is, there seems to be increasing evidence that workers are less committed to firms, and firms may be less committed to workers in the last 30 years or so. I've even seen it with my own students. When I first started teaching 18 years ago, I would see students thinking, I'd like to pick firm X or firm Y because it's a great place to work. And they were implicitly thinking for the long term. Now you'll hear more and more people saying, well, this is a nice place to start, or to get training, or to get credentials for the next kind of position. And I think we've seen through this recession and previous one that the stigma associated with job loss has changed over time. So there seems to be a decline in the implicit contract. There also seems to be some relationship we can see in the next slide that what's also interesting, because of the length of this recession, is there seems to be a longer tail of lower wage increases. So you can see in this picture, which is plotting the employment cost index, which is a quarterly government report of total compensation from 2001 until this quarter. And this is basically increases in compensation costs over a little more than the last decade. You can see that the numbers are historically, at least over the last decade, and even if we go back 20 or 30 years, historically very low. So although unemployment rates are very high, related to that is that pay increases are incredibly low historically, and you can see around 2%, even 1.9%, as we hinted at in the first slide today. In the next slide, I'd like to say a little bit about wages and wage inequality. This is something that's been increasingly talked about with discussion of the 1% versus the 99% and others. This is just a plot on the left-hand side of actual dollars and the right-hand side inflation adjusted. Let's focus on the right-hand side, the inflation adjusted dollars, for a minute. This is a plot of the 5th percentile, the 25th percentile, the median, the 75th percentile, and the 95th percentile of wage and salary income for full-time workers in the U.S. every year from the late 1970s through last year. And what's interesting about this is something that many of us already know, that wages have been actually quite flat, even adjusting, wages have been quite flat adjusting for inflation, even for folks at the median. Even the 75th percentile, which is the second line from the top, wages are just increasing a little bit relative to inflation. It's only at the very top, that is the 95th percentile, those earning, where one would be earning more than where 1 out of 20 people is. That's roughly about $100,000 a year now. This axis is dollars per hour. So if you take that $50 per hour and multiply by a full-time worker, 2,000 hours in a year, it's about $100,000 in a year.
So let me just ask one question, Kevin. I'm sure people are wondering what drives this. But what drives this, I think, also connects to one of the questions that's just come in about how does education level connect with unemployment. So could you say a little bit about what economists might call returns to education, this picture that you've got up as just slide, and also what it means for the likelihood of being unemployed?
There's a lot of questions in that one question, and we're only here for half an hour, but I'll say a little bit about it. There actually there's a lot of literature on this about why is it that there was a dramatic increase in the rate of return to schooling in the 80s, for example, that the gap between persons who had a high school education or less and people with a college education or more increased quite dramatically. And some of that might be related to the kinds of skills or the kinds of workers that are needed in a changing economy, maybe the decline in manufacturing, changes in unionization in the U.S. I think that's part of it. I think there also, we won't have time to show the statistics, but there are dramatic differences in terms of unemployment by level of education. So there are some recessions where poorly educated people fare better relative to poorly educated people in other recessions. It's a little bit hard to say overall, and the reason is that the unemployment rate isn't just the people who aren't working in a particular education category or gender category or whatever it might be, whatever the demographic might be, because as we showed before, even as we're increasing jobs, the unemployment rate increased because some workers are moving back into the labor force thinking that the things might be getting better.
One of the other questions that we had come in was how the income differentials, not just for men and women, but for people with disabilities, and also what it means, what a recession might mean for someone who has an additional barrier to working. I know this recession has hit people with disabilities particularly hard. Is there something about income distribution or issues of income gap that we're also seeing in these kind of data?
Yeah, absolutely. The income, the gap between the earnings of persons with disabilities and without disabilities is actually quite interesting, and it's something that our institute, the Institute for Compensation Studies, is working on with the Employment and Disability Institute, headed by Suzanne Briere. We're working on a grant where we're comparing the earnings of people with disabilities to persons without, and not just the wage gap, which is what's often studied by labor economists, but the total compensation gap. So we're estimating the wage gap, which might be, let's say, $6,000 on the basis of something like $45,000 of earnings in a year, but also the total compensation gap. And we're trying to investigate, some folks think that estimating the total compensation gap, which might include things like benefits, might be more important when thinking about a population like persons with disabilities or one who has a family member with disabilities, because things like health insurance and other kinds of insurance might matter even more. We'll get back to that a little bit later when we talk more about the difference between wages and salaries and total compensation.
So on this issue of the overall increase in compensation costs, we did get a question asking about whether these increases are nominal or real. Are they controlling for inflation? These are the percentage increase in compensation, in total compensation. In this picture, that's been divided out between benefits and wages and salaries. So of the 1.9% inflation rate or increase in total compensation that Kevin mentioned as the top line employment cost index, when we separate out the wages and salaries and the benefits, you can really see the flatlining that the increased cost for wages and salaries has experienced in the last couple of years. These are percentage increases, and so in that sense, the real or nominal isn't an issue because this is a percent. What does matter, though, is how big are these relative to inflation. And inflation has been, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, has been around the 2% mark. So we're really seeing these increases sometimes below inflation, sometimes above inflation, but not consistently above inflation. So wages and salaries are really just barely holding on in terms of increases relative to inflation. Now you can see the benefits numbers have been jumping around a lot more. Some of those rapid increases in total benefits costs post-2010 came because the costs were increasing for employers as they put back in place some benefits that they had cut during 2008-2009. So for example, many employers froze their 401k contributions. They just made none for 2008-2009. As they started putting that money back into the 401ks for their employees, that would cause the benefits costs to go up. But if we take the benefits costs and split it even more finely, so now we've got total benefits still there as the dark blue line, but pull out from that health benefits. The other thing that's been really notable in the last 2 years is how health benefit inflation to employers has really been suppressed in this relatively weak labor market. If we just focus in on 2010, 2011 and 2012, so since the recession has officially ended, you can see that the increases in health benefit costs to employers is pretty much in step with total benefits. This is really dramatically different from what we've seen historically. We are used to hearing about rapidly rising health benefit costs for employers, and we just really haven't seen that in the last 2 years. And I think that's a real question then, in terms of compensation mix. So if we think about what the costs of total compensation are, I've just broken out total benefits and health benefits, but can you put that in the perspective of the overall compensation?
Yeah, the overall compensation's actually fascinating to me. So this graphic shows that although the average cost for a worker in the United States is $30.11, only $20.91 of that goes in the employee's pocket per hour for wage and salary income. So just about only 70 cents on the dollar paid by employers goes to employees in terms of wage and salary income. Now, don't be confused with taxation. This has nothing to do with employees' taxes, payroll taxes, federal taxes, state taxes, nothing to do with that. It's just that for every hour worked, $9.21 on average paid by an employer doesn't go to the employee in terms of wage and salary income. It's everything else. And that can include things like health insurance, vacation time, sick time, anything like that. So while at the same time employees, sometimes we'll hear from the press or from others and say, why is it that employers are saying our costs are going up, it's very expensive, it's costing us more to have workers. At the same time, employees are saying my wages are flat. Well, this picture shows exactly where that's happening in the pictures that Linda just showed a minute ago. Workers' wages can be flat, but because benefits costs are increasing to the extent that workers have benefits, the employer costs can go up. So at the same time that we have a flat wage profile, wage and salary profile, we can have increasing costs for employers.
And can you just say, we did get a question in asking about bonuses and other cash comp. And I'm going to connect that question to one we got in advance, which was asking about pay mix and what our company's doing. So could you just talk a little bit about, given the slow overall economic recovery where businesses are still struggling with the bottom line, the very weak labor market that we're seeing, how are companies pulling that together, and what are they doing with their compensation structures?
Again, that's a big question, but I'll try. I think that one thing that they're doing is which is related to the jobs part, not the pay part, is kind of reluctant to hire people because hiring is costly, and bringing people on, there are fixed costs of doing that, the training, the interviewing costs, and so on. The second is that I think there is more experimentation with what we call pay for performance. We hear about that a lot for senior executives, CEOs, that sort of thing, where it's maybe easier to think about what the bottom line is or what the performance metrics might be. It's particularly difficult for some jobs to do that, though, to link some measure of performance. Is it really the worker's performance? Is it the organization's performance? Is it the group performance? There are different ways you can do that. My own personal opinion is it's best not to have one measure, because if you have one measure, people do that thing, and it may be to the detriment of others. But what you said reminds me of organizations that have this sort of we're in it together kind of mentality, where they are doing performance or gain sharing or profit sharing kinds of schemes. So that is they share, the firm is sharing profits when things are good for the firm. The problem with that, though, is that that is lowering base guaranteed salaries for workers and is actually shifting some of the costs, some of the risk from the firm to the workers. And firms on average, larger groups on average, can handle risk better than individuals. That's why we have insurance, for example. And so for a given worker, they might prefer to have if you're going to ask a worker to give up, to have fluctuating pay, they might want to have a higher base to sort of protect themselves against that kind of fluctuation.
Although that does also connect to the issue of unemployment, because if you do have gain sharing, if you do have ways to adjust the compensation down when times are tough, that would suggest that you wouldn't have to lay people off instead. Do you see that mix?
Absolutely. In fact, there are some, Lincoln Electric's the famous example of this, of an organization that's had not laid workers off for a dramatically long time. And the idea there is that when times are tough, all workers cut back rather than laying off some workers. Everyone gets their hours reduced. They do deferred maintenance, do other kinds of things around the organization. In fact, 17 U.S. states have something called Worksharing unemployment insurance. So rather than the typical unemployment that most of us know about, let's say a firm wants to cut 10% of its costs. One way to do that, of its labor costs, could be to cut 10% of the workforce. An alternative, which is available in 17 U.S. states, is to offer something which is called work-sharing unemployment insurance. In that situation, you could effectively, although there are hybrids and combinations of this, would be to reduce everyone's hours by 10% and have them prorated unemployment insurance benefits. There's a surprisingly small number of organizations that take this up, that is, participate in this program, and it's not obvious why. It hasn't been studied very much. I think the reason why, my own view is that firms don't like this, and actually some workers don't like this, because workers, everyone's affected when you cut back with this, everyone's 10%. And workers sort of figure, well, I want to keep my job, and if other people go, I think it might depend on the industry, the income level. Obviously, very high income workers can afford a 10% cutback. People with very low income might not be able to. It's a complicated issue and has not really been very well studied yet. So how do employees think about their compensation in this kind of very weak labor market? I mean, if people are concerned about what they can control or what they can influence, what would your recommendations be in terms of what do you do? I think it's a difficult question, and lots of people come up to me and say, well, geez, how can I make more? How can I get ahead at work? What can I do? I think there are a couple of ways to do that. One is to think about how your company pays. What is your company doing? How does it make money? How does it get ahead? It doesn't have to be a for-profit firm. It could be a nonprofit organization, whatever it is. What is it doing? And does it have a pay system that is doing the right, getting them there? Now, if your company doesn't have a pay system, or your organization doesn't have a pay system that's any good, then this maybe isn't very good advice. But it's useful to think about how your company pays. Many organizations do it right. And what you can do to help that company do what it's doing. I think that's the first step to earning more. Another issue is to think, and we had some, we didn't talk about these, but there are some salary budget increase surveys that are saying that maybe next year's average pay might be going up about 3%. Some people are saying, well, 3%, is that enough? What should we do in a situation like that? I think it's useful for employees to think about total compensation, not just wage and salary income. Especially in a time when budgets are tight, what does a worker do? What else can they do? I think it's useful to think about other ways that companies pay. I think of, I worked in the ILR school at Cornell. I'm paid a wage and salary. I'm paid benefits. There are all kinds of special benefits for being here. I've access to a library and a gym and things like that. I also think, though, about it's useful for all employees to think about other attributes of their job. Things I like about my job, there's some on this slide. I guess there's career progression. I started out as a brand new assistant professor, and now I'm aging, and all of a sudden I'm a senior professor. The quality of my colleagues matters a lot. My working conditions, the tools I have to get the work done that I want to get done. All of those are part of one's job, and I think should be appreciated by workers. And maybe your firm can't offer you a higher salary this year, but maybe there's some training budget or something else you like about work and that you value. That's a way to get paid more. Again, it's not more dollars for gifts or your mortgage or your rent, but it is higher levels of pay.
Is there a way to put dollar values on these things? If you're trying to decide whether you want to stay or go at your current job, can you assign dollar values to those intangibles?
I get asked that question. I'm an economist, so I think people can put dollar values on things. I think some people say you can't monetize certain things. I think, though, if you say you can't monetize something, you're implicitly assuming that it's zero. So imagine two jobs. One job has a wage and salary of $40,000 per year, and terrible work conditions. The colleagues are unfriendly. You don't have the right tools to get your work done. And another job where there's career progression. You've got a nice office. You like your colleagues. Clearly, that second job is a better job. The pay is higher. In the way I think about pay, the total reward is higher. And if you monetize that at zero, then you can't decide among those two jobs, but clearly you can. I think some people have trouble monetizing certain things. My wife once said, we lived in a certain house, we'll never sell this house. I thought, well, wait a minute, what if somebody walked up and offered us $5 million for this house? I would take the money and leave. And she agreed to that. So obviously we can put prices on things. It's hard to do, but I think in thinking about transitioning from one job to another, or thinking about your current job, it's worth thinking about those things. Maybe it's worth thinking about them before the next job comes along, so you really do have an appreciation for your total reward.
Well, and you do see that as the labor market starts to heat up, which hopefully it will in the next few months, but we are starting to see certain jobs like in technology, professional support system jobs. Those are starting to creep up in compensation. The advertisements for those jobs are going up. So that's the point at which people say, my industry, my job, my occupation is kind of coming back. There are more options, and they start to think about these things. So even though we're in a weak labor market now, it does seem like as an HR professional, you want to be thinking ahead in terms of how do you keep people happy at this point, because at some point the labor market's going to get tighter again.
Right, absolutely.
Well, we're just about out of our time. We've been able to give you a little more insight on the context around the labor market. And we have special thanks to several of our team who helped us on this. And we have more ILR online webcasts coming up, so we hope that you tune in to those as the notifications and announcements come out on those in the future. And thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks.